A man sits beneath a beech tree. The late afternoon sun is scattered by its leaves into dancing glimmers atop his bald head. The man, Benjamin, takes a drag off of a slim cigarette as he waits for his wife, Eloise, to finish work and come meet him. Benny had always been a thinker, and today's topic of choice was the very set of mechanisms that allowed him the privilege. A few days ago, he'd been sweeping up the corridor outside Eloise's classroom while she had been teaching the children about memory, how it was formed and how it would remain or not. Benjamin had lived a long time, and it entertained him to think of just how many photographs and smiles and birthdays and sunsets were spelled out in fireworks he couldn't see. The fleshy walnut behind Benjamin's eyes held close a childhood defiantly happy in the face of post-war rations and poverty, and the anger of the brash, cockney youngster determined to be the first in his family to attend university. He'd never much enjoyed the stuffy stasis of formal education, but he'd had a point to prove in getting there, in making it. His mind clutched tightly the only reason he'd stayed. Eloise, the short and feisty blonde he'd met in a crowded ballroom, and later wed on a French beach away from the eyes of her disapproving parents. A youth spent craving adventure mellowed into a quiet but enduring love, a little house with 3 children, a number of dogs and cats, and gentle days spent whistling away as Benjamin worked as the local school's caretaker. Benjamin had never attained the riches he'd longed for as a boy, but his memory was worth the world's weight in gold and more. However, as he and we will discover in this video, memory and money have one thing in common: they can burn. On the 14th of June 1864, a man was born who would change the way we, wrinkled and bloody computers piloting flesh-armoured bones, understand ourselves. Alois Alzheimer was a curious child with a love for the natural sciences, which would lead him to study medicine. At university, he worked hard and played pranks with his fraternity brothers that would almost lead to his expulsion. In 1888, he would start work as a junior doctor at a psychiatric hospital in Frankfurt, where he would later meet a woman who had become his most famous patient and would forever tie his name to the disease named after him, Alzheimer's disease. Alzheimer's disease can be categorized according to the Global Deterioration Scale, the GDS, for the assessment of primary degenerative dementia. The scale is divided into stages 1 through 7, which chart the cognitive decline of the patient, although the first stage describes somebody who is asymptomatic, so the second stage, very mild cognitive decline, will be considered here as the true first stage, if you will. Looking back on his past, that afternoon beneath the beech tree, Benjamin thought of just how fragile memory was. He loved his job and watching over the students who so resembled himself as a boy, so much so that retirement had never been much of a consideration. He couldn't deny, though, that things were slowing. More and more often he would misplace his broom or forget the names of the different wings of the school. Even the science wing, which had been named after a dear friend of his, a professor who had long since passed. Eloise had confessed on their walk home that evening her desire to renew their wedding vows on the beach where they had eloped as youngsters, and Benjamin was surprised he couldn't remember the name of the place. "It doesn't matter," Eloise had said, squeezing his hand and giving him a kiss on the cheek. "I'll look it up on the computer." Time passed, although Benjamin was unsure how much. It escaped him so quickly nowadays. And the couple had been rewriting their vows. Benjamin had been excited at first, reliving the dizzy thrill of his first years with his beloved wife. Every time he sat down to write, however, he couldn't. He knew what to say, the emotions were there, but no words would come. They were misplaced somewhere, like his broom and mop after long working days. Eloise had asked him to go down to the new travel agents in town to ask about flights to France in the coming year, and he'd gotten so lost he had to call her to come pick him up. His ears burned and his eyes stung with embarrassment. This wasn't him. He'd always known where to go. He was always the one who led his family home safely after a long holiday hike. Always the one holding the map on their road trips. He'd been having problems at the school, too. "I don't know what they're talking about, Lou," he'd grumble over dinner. "They say I keep getting distracted and that my floors are dirty. It's nonsense. I've kept the place spotless for 40 years. Eloise would nod and listen, but the concern in her face was unmistakable. She reached out to pat his arm. "And they've been lucky to have you. I think you deserve to rest now. I've been thinking of retiring too, because of my knees, so you won't be alone." The different types of dementia progress in different ways. Alzheimer's disease, the most common type of dementia, tends to progress steadily over time. Vascular dementia, the second most common type, advances in a stepwise fashion, alternating between periods of stability and rapid decline. Lewy body dementia progresses rapidly, with deaths most common in the first 7 years after diagnosis. Progression in frontotemporal dementia varies greatly. On the 25th of November 1901, a man brought his wife to a psychiatric facility in Frankfurt, Germany. The woman, a housewife named Augusta Data, was in her early 50s, but was losing her memory, having trouble sleeping, and struggling with delusional thoughts. At the facility, Augusta would meet Dr. Alzheimer, who would become fascinated with her case. She would forget objects that had been shown to her moments after she'd seen them, and had trouble assigning the correct names to people or things. Her condition would worsen at night. Her speech would become confused, and she would wake up screaming. Augusta would become the first person ever to be diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. As the days galloped on, it fell on Eloise to look after the house. Benjamin had only grown more confused since they'd both retired, and although it hurt them both, they had decided to call off the vow renewal until after he'd had some rest and gotten better. Things weren't getting better, though. Soon after his work had ended, Benjamin had chatted on and on and on about how excited he was to focus more on his garden and spend more time with her, watching their favourite home improvement programs. Now he could barely remember which button did what on the remote he'd always insisted he was the expert on, and his well-worn gardening gloves lay on the unkempt grass outside, grey and rotting in the rain. He'd become quieter too, his voice flat, the defiant grin she'd fallen for all those years ago gone from his drooping face. Their children had noticed too, when they'd stop by for dinner or to help with the chores. Dad would ask them the same questions again and again, and would look lost in conversations about treasured family holidays. Although he'd vehemently deny over and over that anything was wrong, Benjamin and Eloise's eldest child eventually managed to drag his father to the doctor, and later to the specialist the doctor would refer him to. The psychiatrist confirmed what the family was trying so hard to wish away. Benjamin had Alzheimer's disease. When Augusta Data was asked questions she could no longer answer, she would reply, "I have lost myself, so to say." Benjamin lived in a perpetual fog. Time evaporated into the mist, intangible to hands that moved in slow motion. His self-assurances that nothing was wrong had no walls to echo from in a world crumbling like a hometown to an unforeseen blaze, and died silently in the ether. Eloise still had her husband. Around 2 years had passed since his diagnosis, 2 years that had sprinted by and taken so much with them. Every day she would help him wash and dress himself, kissing him as she had done every morning they had awoken to together, and making sure his buttons were even before walking with him to the kitchen. Some days he still thought it was the 1950s, and would ask Eloise if she'd take a break from her thesis to come dance the night away in the music hall so close to campus. Most days he had no idea when he was at all. There were still a few constants, but nobody could say for sure how long they would remain so. He still laughed, still enjoyed eating cake and reminiscing and slowly waltzing around the kitchen with her. She clutched Benjamin's hand tighter every day. He'd ask her what she was so panicked about, and it would both comfort and break her when his old smirk would flicker back to life oh so briefly. At diagnosis, Benjamin had been prescribed his donepezil tablets. A few months ago, he'd been switched onto memantine. Eloise had always been bookish, but only one thing about her research on the drug stayed with her. Benjamin's tablets were changed because he was getting worse. She welcomed the new ways his occupational therapist would help him navigate his everyday tasks. Benjamin loved the friends he'd made in his cognitive stimulation therapy group. Eloise had started working with him on a life story scrapbook, which itself was a memory she'd treasure, but a cold little voice always remained, breathing down her neck that all anyone could do was delay the inevitable. When Augusta Data passed away on the 8th of April 1906, her brain and medical records were sent to Dr. Alzheimer, who had since moved on to a clinic in Munich. On examination, Augusta's cortex had atrophied significantly. The cortex is responsible for thought, language, and memory. These findings were not uncommon in older people, but Augusta had died in her 50s. These findings would catalyze huge change in the way we view memory. Despite proving of little interest to many at the meeting where Dr. Alzheimer presented the case, one of his colleagues, a Dr. Emil Kraepelin, was excited and included Alzheimer's disease in his text Psychiatry in 1910. Today, the pathological investigation of Alzheimer's disease is very similar to the methods Alzheimer used in 1906. He was a pioneer in the linking of a patient's symptoms with physical changes in the brain. Benjamin eventually stopped speaking. He would grunt and his mouth would open and close, but no words would come out. Soon after, he stopped walking. He was incontinent and Eloise spoon-fed him his meals every day. Benjamin's mind had long forgotten his body, but she knew he was still in there. Some days she felt like screaming when nurses and neighbours and friends came over to their house and looked at him as if he were a sad stain on the carpet, or ignored him completely. He's still here. Although she'd had to argue with the family, Eloise had eventually persuaded them that Benjamin should spend his final days at home. It was what he would have wanted. The kids pitched in to help care for him. Eloise was too tired to do everything now, but she was adamant. He's lived here for 40 years. This is home. When social workers and nurses came in to risk assess and to check in on the couple, they found walls covered floor to ceiling with photos and the little coffee table between their matching armchairs hampered with flowers and keepsakes from decades long past. An ancient vinyl spun lazily in the corner, playing Benjamin's favourite big band and swing records. Benjamin passed away in front of a crackling fireplace, his wife's hand in his. He may have long faded away, but his home, a monument to his love and his life, still remained, and kept him safe and warm until the very end. The format and presentation of this video were heavily inspired by the album Everywhere at the End of Time, created by The Caretaker, a moniker used by musician Leyland James Kirby. The album, a 6.5-hour-long epic told in 6 stages, seeks to explore the journey of a dementia patient through music and its gradual decay. The music used throughout this video is taken from the album. The album, and the bizarre paintings of artist Ivan Seal, which serve as its cover art, comprise the most part of the interactive element of this presentation. The album is an impactful and a harrowing listen if you ever have the time. Linked on your digital fact sheet, you will also find some videos created to simulate the difficulties experienced by dementia patients in everyday life. They're much shorter than the album, each to the tune of a few minutes. I discovered Everywhere at the End of Time by pure chance while browsing YouTube last summer. I listened to the entire thing over the course of an evening. It is now one of my favourite pieces of art and has stayed with me ever since. I simply had to include it in this video. The titles of this video's segments, and our patient's name, Benjamin, are all taken from track titles on the album or the caretaker's other works. I chose Alzheimer's disease as the form of dementia most central to this case because its gradual decline is reflected very well by the music, and I really enjoyed researching Dr. Alzheimer himself and how the case of Augusta Data led to the first ever diagnosis of the disease. When memory fades, due to either our own internal decay or the indifferent passage of time into history, it is up to those remaining to tell the stories of those who are no longer with us or whose voices have fallen silent. I had never heard of Augusta Data until I started researching for this video and knew nothing of Dr. Alzheimer's life or work. It is quite disorienting to think about how neither of them knew the impact they would have on millions of lives. Also linked on the fact sheet, along with other sources used, will be some pages discussing their stories. I encourage you to go on your own internet adventure and get to know them. Alzheimer's disease has no cure. 1 in 14 people aged over 65 in the UK has it, and numbers are increasing as the population ages. People from an ethnic minority background are less likely to receive a diagnosis, and Alzheimer's disease is more likely to affect those with learning disabilities. Linked on the fact sheet will be charities and organisations dedicated to researching and fighting the disease and dementia in general. Thank you so much for watching.